Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Institute of World Politics. I'm very glad you could join us this afternoon for Professor Goble's discussion. For those of you who've never been here before, or who don't know very much about the Institute of World Politics is a graduate school of national security and international affairs. We pride ourselves on providing a graduate-level education in all of the instruments of statecraft. We have master's degrees in statecraft and national security affairs, statecraft and international affairs, strategic intelligence studies. We also have several executive MA programs and certificate programs. Very pleased to welcome our adjunct professor, Paul Goble, who teaches Islam and geopolitics in Eurasia with us. Professor Goble is a longtime specialist on ethnic and religious questions in Eurasia. He's the director of research and publications at Azerbaijan's Diplomatic Academy. Formerly, he served as vice dean for the social sciences and humanities at Audentes University, if I have that right, in Tallinn, and also at the University of Tartu in Estonia. Of course, before that, he had a very long and distinguished career in the United States government. He served with the United States State Department, Central Intelligence Agency, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and Voice of America. He's a graduate of the University of Chicago, and one of the things he's best known for today is as an author and blogger. He's written numerous books on Eurasia, and he's also author of the popular blog Window on Eurasia. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Paul Goble.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here and to have the chance to speak about Natalie Grant Raga. I am semi-retired, and increasingly one thinks about the people who are no longer with us and their passing, and it has been one of the great blessings of my life that I'm just old enough to have known the generation that put American foreign policy together after World War II, the wise men. I was close friends with George Kennan and with Paul Nitze, and with their next generation, Jim Schlesinger and that crowd. It is thus a particular pleasure to have the chance to talk about Natalie Raga, as I would probably call her, because that is how I know her. Natalie Grant is how many of you will know, and if you want to Google her, you better use Natalie Grant, Natalie Raga. She is one of the people that links together several worlds that have been important in my life and that are important, I think, for our understanding of the world. She was born Natalia Konstantinovna Mann in Tallinn in 1901. In 1917, she and her family fled to Crimea to avoid the Bolshevik risings in Estonia. She returned there, worked for an American relief enterprise, and married someone, which is where the Grant comes from, divorced him within weeks because she discovered he was passing mail to communists, and for Natalie that was enough not to have anything to do with him, certainly not to be married to. By 1926, she was hired to be the secretary of the Riga legation. The American legation in Riga served as the training academy for the great generation of American Russian specialists, William Thompson, George Kennan, and so forth. She was George Kennan's secretary, and throughout the rest of her life, and she was to live to the age of 101, which disproves the idea that the good die young. She referred to George Kennan always as the good George Kennan. I think she had an idea that there was a bad George Kennan out there, and it was important that people know that she was on the right side. Throughout her life, she was obsessed with the idea of trying to understand, through the public statements and propaganda of foreign governments, what they were trying to do. And she understood, as anyone working in that business does, that many statements by governments, and certainly by government propagandists, are not true. When I worked at the State Department, one of my bosses liked to chant, join the Foreign Service, get a chance to lie for your country. And there are people who see that as a universal characteristic of government service. She, however, was less interested in the kind of easy-to-detect lies than the more difficult ones. Blatant propaganda, outright lies, saying, for example, as the Putin government has, that the Ukrainians shot down the Malaysian airliner, or that the government in Kiev is fascist, are easy to dismiss because they're so obviously untrue. What Natalie understood, and what she taught a generation of specialists in this city, because she came here after the war, having married Rica Vraga, who was the head of Polish counterintelligence against the Soviet Union in the late 30s and early 40s, and who was, beginning in 1947, to be the chief collector of information on and the author of an important book, unfortunately not published publicly, on the trust, Operacja Trest, which was the Cheka's first great intelligence operation against the Russian immigration. But what Natalie understood, and I had the privilege of meeting with her a number of times in the 1980s and early 1990s at her house up in Point of Rocks, just near Leesburg. She's always listed as Leesburg, but in fact, she said, I do not live in Leesburg, I live in Point of Rocks. And she was legally blind at the end, although she could see well enough to read everything she wanted to read. And I have to tell you, I think the legal blindness was a way to force other people to drive her around. But one of the things that she focused on, and she taught me and many, many others, is to understand something that is usually glossed over in the public press and all too often in government analysis as well. And that is the distinction between propaganda, which may be true or false, and disinformation, which has a particular relationship to the truth and which is far more insidious and far more dangerous. As she said repeatedly, disinformation can be 99% true. In fact, it will be most effective if it's 99% true, because people will accept the 100th% as true when it clearly isn't. And the task of an analyst, the task of a government official, is to find that 1%, which is misleading. These days, people use disinformation to mean something that's not true. But it's not just that. Disinformation is something of a very particular kind. If I tell you a story and you believe everything you can verify easily, you're probably going to accept all the rest of it. And in fact, the most effective propaganda is that kind of propaganda. Natalie wrote a series of books where she analyzed Soviet statements, pointing out exactly where the line was between truth and falsehood. And she gave, by my count, half a dozen different definitions of disinformation. But I think that the best one, and the one I'd like to begin with, and then I want to talk about my thinking about disinformation today, and then come back to talking about what we all ought to be doing with Natalie's legacy. Because unfortunately, for people who are much younger than I am, which already is most of the world, most of you, she's someone that we don't hear much about. And I can report to you that although she was the author of more than 30 different studies, none of them are in print. And only one is available in a single copy on ABE Books, which is the best search engine for getting one. And not surprisingly, it's in Germany. But I won't go there what that means. But Natalie said, and this was in 1998, 4 years before her death, she said, if I believe that the Cold War is over, and I tell you that, that is misinformation. But if I do not believe it is over, but I tell you that it is, just to make you abandon your defenses, that is disinformation. In other words, it is describing something in a way that is untrue, but only untrue in part, and is intended to get specific actions from the person that it's directed at. I think that the events of the last 6 months had to do with the Russian subversion and invasion of Ukraine, and the remarkable success that Vladimir Putin has had with his propaganda effort, make it important that we understand the difference between out-and-out false propaganda, which ultimately, despite the attention it gets, some of it's so outrageous you can't not pay attention to it. I don't know how many of you have followed the list that's been maintained by the Los Angeles Times. For some weeks, they were producing first the list of the top 20 lies Putin had told. Then, a few days later, it was the top 40 lies Putin had told. I think they gave up after they got to 100 lies that Putin had told. But finding the lies are not interesting. What is important is to find the conclusions that those hearing those things were supposed to reach. And Natalie said, in another place, another one of her definitions, that disinformation constitutes planned, conscious deception for gain. And she insisted that people who are trained as analysts of the Soviet Union or of Russia had to spend their time finding out what was true and what was false, rather than thinking that once they had classified something as propaganda, they had done their job. And I couldn't agree more. We have all been struck, I think, over the last 6 months by the willingness and ability of the Russian government to openly lie about all kinds of things in Ukraine. There have been statements made that are so 180 degrees away from the facts that it's quite amazing that they are made at all, and it is disturbing how widely they have been accepted as true, both in the Russian Federation, and perhaps even more dangerous or more disturbing that they have been accepted so widely outside. Within the Russian Federation, there are obvious explanations for why people may accept something, or at least say that they accept it, because of course people who are there are subject to what we've seen in the revival of fear, and they are prepared, as many people are in other countries, to go along with what the leadership says, even when their own eyes tell them it isn't true. As the Marx Brothers put, who are you going to believe? What I tell you, or your own eyes? And it's quite often the case that people will believe what they're told and not their own eyes, and that's not limited to Russians. But what is more interesting is the impact of this campaign on people in the West. We have seen in the last 6 months not simply a dramatic expansion in the willingness of Moscow to deliver statements which it knows to be untrue, but more importantly, an elaboration of the most skilled use of disinformation, of a mix of those things which are true for sure, those things which are possibly true, and those things which are demonstrably false, in a way to achieve an effectiveness and impact, both inside the Russian Federation and in the West, with greater success than is any time in the history of the Russian state. Now, what I want to do in sort of the core part of my talk is to ask 3 questions and give you my ideas about them, and then I want to, as I said, to go back to talk a little bit about Natalie's legacy and what we ought to be doing with it. And then, of course, we can have time for discussion and questions. And you will forgive me for leaning on the podium. It's really bad to do that, but I have an illness that makes it very difficult for me not to do that. Okay. The 3 questions that I want to address are these. So you'll know when I get to the third one, I'm about to shut up. The first question is, What is disinformation? How do I understand it, and how do we see it? I'm sorry? And how do we determine what it is? Okay. The second question is, why is it so incredibly effective? Because it's vastly more effective than blatant propaganda, than crude propaganda. Disinformation works. Propaganda doesn't after a certain point. And to understand that is important because we're going to see probably a lot more of it. And third, how can it be identified? What do you have? What kind of skill sets do you need? And therefore, how can you counter it? Because information is now a key central part of war, and the use of information war is central. And within information war, disinformation is increasingly important, not only for the Russian side, but for other sides as well. So that what we can learn from the Russian disinformation campaign with respect to Ukraine can be extrapolated to the disinformation campaigns of other governments on other occasions. What makes disinformation so effective is that it is not the same thing as lying. It is not the same thing as simply telling people something that they almost certainly will know is untrue. Instead, disinformation combines three things, and it's that combination that makes it so powerful. First, a great deal of disinformation is true. It is a statement about the world as it really is, and therefore people are inclined to accept the rest of it because they've accepted that which is true. Natalie, at various places, gave the percentage of true statements in disinformation efforts as being between 90 and 99%. Depending on your audience, the tougher the audience, the more true it has to be. The more resistance there is to the message you want to get people to change, the more truth you have to include in disinformation to achieve your ends. The second component of disinformation is that it has to include that which people want to be true. It is unfortunately the case that not only ethnic Russians, but large numbers of American scholars and American government officials accept the notion that Ukrainians and Belarusians are byproducts of the ethnogenetic origins of the Russian nation. That, my friends, is totally and completely untrue. Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians emerged out of a common East Slavic tribal area at roughly the same time. There were no Russians in the 10th century. But if you were to ask 99 and 4400% of Russian specialists on Mass Avenue, I promise you they believe, or they want to believe, that there is a Russian ethnogenesis and Ukrainians and Belarusians are unfortunate byproducts. It's what people want to believe. It's not true, but it's what people want to believe. And if you tie that together, you make your argument stronger. And finally, and this is why I think Natalie's writings are so important, disinformation has to contain something that is demonstrably false, but that, like medicine that you put in sugar, it goes down because of the rest. And it's amazing how small those things can be. And what that in turn means, what that combination means, is that what defines disinformation, what sets it apart from mere propaganda, is not the percentage of truth or the percentage of lies, but rather the ways in which it is designed, carried out, and ultimately accepted or rejected. If you look at a propaganda effort and you classify it as only being true or false, you miss the most important means a government has of projecting its image and promoting its ideas on others. What is striking is that within the Russian political system, there is active discussion of exactly how you do these things What there is not in the American political system is a discussion of how you do these things or how you counter them. Instead, we remain locked into the question of whether it is true or false. What I started with by talking to you about the lists of the 20 lies or 40 lies or 100 lies of Vladimir Putin is to miss the point. It is precisely this combination of the true, of what people would like to be true, and what is demonstrably false that gets most people's attention, certainly outside of the Russian Federation, but also inside. Now, in contrast to most governments around the world, Moscow, and before that St. Petersburg, has had a long history of using disinformation. The Tsarist regime did it beginning in the 16th century and right through the end. The Soviet regime did it. In fact, disinformation was one of the textbooks that was required reading for people in the NKVD down through the KGB. When the Soviet power collapsed in Lithuania and the KGB library there was left behind, one of the textbooks was called Disinformation. And the most interesting thing part of it was that there were specific chapters on how to appeal to very, very specific groups. What you could lie about, what you couldn't lie about, and what you could insert because what people wanted to believe. It's interesting that that should be true. I regret to say that although the list of the books in that archive have been published, the archive itself, just like the Smolensk archive earlier, has not been fully exploited. But what is striking now is that we have the Putin regime doing all this and doing it in such a blatant way that you would think we would have recognized this and we would have been careful about classifying things as propaganda or as disinformation. We have to know that the crude propaganda is not what is important. If you are going to appeal to elites, either domestically or abroad, it's going to be necessary to use disinformation to build on what people know to be true, what they want to be true, and we have seen that happen both inside the Russian Federation and outside. If you look at what the Putin disinformation campaign concerning Crimea in particular has been about, you'll see exactly how the Kremlin has combined these three elements. First, let us admit the following fact. It is absolutely true, as Moscow insists, that Crimea has a longer history of ties to Russia than do other parts of Ukraine. But that's to miss the point, of course, because the notion that it has always been Russian doesn't work very well given that the Russians occupied it in 1783. Nor is it true that it was passed back and forth between Crimea and Russia before 1917. What was done with the handover of Crimea in 1954, and that's something that people in the West should pay a lot more attention to, had very little to do with making the Ukrainians, or paying off the Ukrainians as Nikita Sergeyevich was supposed to have done, but rather it had to do with the fact that by transferring Crimea as an autonomous republic into Ukraine, the Soviet leadership made it almost impossible for Ukraine to side with the non-Russian republics, because it would face secession within its own territory. It was to create a second republic like the RSFSR. Okay? Second, it is not true that Crimea is Russian in the sense that Moscow means. Not only are the ethnic Russians who are indigenous, or Autochthonian, if you will, to the region, fundamentally different than Russians in Vologda or Moscow, but the Russians who have been moved in are a deracinated lot and dream. And one of the most frightening things about what is going on in eastern Ukraine is that what we are seeing is not the actions of Muscovites, we are seeing the actions of a lumpen Russian population. But if you allied that, as Putin has, you can get a long way. And it is demonstrably not true that ethnic Russians in Crimea were being persecuted and oppressed by the Ukrainian authorities. Unless you believe that any place there are Russians, there must be a Russian government, which I'm afraid Mr. Putin seems to think. But I will tell you the belief that if a Russian is in a country that has not got a Russian government, that he's being oppressed, is accepted extraordinarily widely as something a lot of people want to believe. Otherwise, it gets very, very difficult to know why. After not doing it for more than 10 years, the New York Times publishes an article on Latvian oppression of ethnic Russians within a week of Russian occupation and annexation of Crimea. It's what people wanted to believe, and therefore it was an effective way of communicating that and reaching beyond your base. What has been disturbing to me is that these three themes have worked together: the true, the wannabe true, and the demonstrably false, and they have worked much more successfully abroad than anyone had any right to expect. Now, why does Vladimir Putin, why does Moscow use disinformation? The answer to that question is very easy. They use it because it works. And it works because revealing it is very hard. It requires expertise, it requires careful tracking, and it requires talking about things people are not comfortable talking about. Namely, a lot of prejudices people have that aren't true, but that predispose them to accept certain things about reality. Hence the New York Times article on the oppressed ethnic Russians of Latvia. Think about it. I mean, imagine any other situation. The countries in between have been victims of that for a very long time. Now, many people in the West, and even many Russians who are opposed to Vladimir Putin's regime, have been shocked that the lies that Mr. Putin has put out about Ukraine have been so effective domestically and have sent Vladimir Putin's public opinion rankings to what are unprecedented heights. The only bracket I would make in this, as it was pointed out last week, that Ceausescu had a 99% approval rating a week before he was shot. But never mind. What we have seen in the West, and indeed among the Moscow intelligentsia, is an effort to somehow come up with an explanation. Almost all these explanations have been inadequate and unsatisfying. People in Moscow and people in the West have blamed the impact of the statements, that the propaganda that the Kremlin has put out, on the fact that Russians overwhelmingly rely on Moscow TV for their news and therefore have no choice but to accept it, that few Russians who have access to other things like internet are willing to take use of it, and that's true as far as it goes, but it still doesn't explain things. As one Russian commentator put it yesterday, even under Russian occupation of Crimea, Ohm's law is still Ohm's law. In other words, things don't change, whereas this assumption that somehow you can completely change reality. And I think an increasing number of people in Moscow, although far fewer in the West than ought to, have pointed out that the increasing repression of the Putin government, which has restored a kind of fear that all of us had hoped was dissipated after 1991, is leading Russians to say things that they may or may not believe. In other words, the expressions of support for Putin's line may be very broad, but very shallow indeed. Obviously, both these factors are there, but neither explains why Putin's disinformation campaign has been so successful. There are, for that, both deeper and much more superficial levels. The deeper level, and it is something that we in the West have been reluctant to face up to, is the enormous sense of grievance that Russians feel about their loss of superpower status and the belief they have that they must leverage the only strength they have as a way of getting back into the game. Americans have been very reluctant to deal with just how traumatic 1991 was and remains for the Russians, how it nearly destroyed their sense of state and statehood and national identity, and they're desperately interested in getting back in the game. It's also the disinformation campaign's superficial, or part of the deeper cause, is that Russians have been told, not just about Ukraine, but about almost everything, that what goes on in the world is not the result of national movements, large parts of the population, but rather is conspiratorial elements like the CIA or the State Department, and therefore are willing to accept that version of reality. Tragically, those deeper causes are not going away anytime soon. But at a more superficial level, and this has attracted somewhat more attention, Putin's disinformation campaign has worked so well in Russia precisely because it has played to all these factors at a time when the Russian economy and Russian society are in a very bad way. The willingness of Americans to lie about the Putin economic miracle is staggering. But Russians have been more willing to listen to the lies and to find a way to take a scapegoat, to blame someone, to have a good little war. And a good little war has the way of suppressing disagreement, because who can disagree with the leader if he is locked in a conflict with the evil empires of the world? But as successful as Putin's disinformation campaign has been inside Russia, with its melding together of truths, untruths, and wannabe statements, it has been vastly more successful outside the borders of the Russian Federation. Not because all of his claims are accepted as true. In fact, people enjoy pointing out how much Putin is lying. You can watch The Daily Show and get that. And not because of the work of some kind of network of Russian agents in the West, although there is very much such a network, and Moscow is now so certain that it won't be challenged, that much of that network is now operating completely openly, as with the case of Andrei Migranyan in New York City, who, if he's not an agent, I don't know what an agent is. But Putin's disinformation campaign, this is a point I really care about making, has been successful in the West because of a fundamental change in the nature of Western journalism and analysis, in which balance has become confused as the same thing as objectivity. And that means that if you can put out enough false statements, they will be included in stories, because you don't want to be accused of being non-objective by not being balanced. And any government that understands that, and the Putin regime does, can simply overload the system with information that is false or partially false, in the full expectation that it will be reported. And that becomes even more true when it happens, as it does in American media, that statements that come out of Moscow are always says, and statements that come out of Kiev are claims. I could have brought my New York Times from this morning and quoted an example of that on page 1, but never mind. Okay. What we see is a situation in which lying, or disinformation, which is a half-lie, is something that really works. And it works more now because of this confusion of objectivity and balance. Balance is not the same thing as objectivity. Objectivity is about a basis for making judgment. Balance is an excuse not to make any judgment at all. And unfortunately, American journalism and Western journalism more generally has totally confused it. The second reason that disinformation has worked so effectively in the West is that there are now so many people in governments, business communities, and the academy whose positions, profits, and careers are dependent on the maintenance of good relations with Russia no matter what. And they are thus unwilling to challenge Russian disinformation, but are often quite prepared to promote Russian claims, especially if at least some of them are plausible or true, objectively true, because they know that will be remembered. And they will be rewarded or not by whether they have done it. Saying that is not something we feel comfortable about doing, but it is important to know these people who are doing this are not agents of Moscow, as some on Fox News might suggest, or even the useful idiots Lenin liked to talk about. Instead, they are a significant constituency which has grown up by the way in which the West chose to read the events of 1991. I would say misread, but at least read it. And we have a situation where disinformation becomes more important because these people can be counted on to be echo chambers. And when they say it, it becomes more important than when its original source coming out of Radio Moscow or Moscow television. And third, and this is disturbing to those of us who spend too much time reading about the 1930s, Vladimir Putin has discovered that Western governments in the main, and there are some notable exceptions, Australia and Canada being the two outstanding members of NATO, are not willing to challenge what Moscow is saying or doing because of fear that one of two things will happen. Either that they will be charged with inciting a new Cold War, or they will prompt Putin to behave even worse. Both arguments you have heard. Let me focus just a bit on the idea of a new Cold War. One could talk about new Cold War as a perfect example of disinformation. Because a Cold War, which is to say a state of conflict without military exchanges, driven by very, very different understandings of what is desirable in the world, is something that you could say exists between many countries. But the understanding, the definition of the Cold War that people who make use of that term are interested in having us adopt, is that the Cold War was something which was so terrible that we must never do it again, and that therefore Moscow can make use of the suggestion that someone is promoting the restoration of the Cold War as a way of undercutting any possibility of discussing doing anything. Again, it's this mix of things which works so well. But it is, in fact, the most frightening thing that people are prepared to allow bombastic or illegal actions and statements to go unchallenged or unmet, because there is a near certainty that they're unchallenged, they will do more. Had the United States and the West taken a tough line in Georgia in August of 2008, Crimea would never have happened. Had the United States and the Western Alliance taken a tough line immediately on the invasion and annexation of Crimea, eastern Ukraine would not have happened. Had the United States and the Western countries taken a hard line on what is going on in Donetsk and Luhansk, instead of imposing on the Ukrainian government requirement that it must make nice with Moscow, we would not see what we have been seeing in the last 5 days, which is the Russian embassy in Riga openly recruiting people to fight, ethnic Russians to fight in Ukraine, and providing them with weapons, some of which may not be used in Ukraine. The idea that making nice is the way that somebody using this against you get them to change it is a very, very dangerous self-deception. Okay. Now, how can we respond? Because I think we have to. I think the idea that we are only dealing with propaganda and that it can be dismissed as propaganda misses the point about the new nature of information warfare and about the fact that this is incredibly effective. It has undermined the ability to mobilize populations against the aggressive violation of international law, which Moscow has engaged in the last 6 months. Earlier too. Oh, just so you know, yesterday, an influential think tank in Moscow called for Moscow now to annex South Ossetia in Georgia, something they felt constrained against doing in 2008 because they were concerned about Western reaction. It's worth noting that the article led with the idea that there's no reason to worry about what the West will say anymore. That's a pretty amazing statement that flows from what we're seeing. Okay. There are 3 things that I believe we in the West need to do if we're going to begin to fight on this particular battlefield in the new war environment. First, we simply need to recognize we are dealing with disinformation rather than just lies. As long as people in the West think they are dealing only with false propaganda, they will miss the point. So you have to understand that disinformation is a new kind of thing, at least in the volume that we are seeing. Second, it means that Western countries are going to have to develop the kinds of expertise to identify disinformation. Natalie Grant worked 8 years to write a single book analyzing the set of Soviet statements having to do with the Far Eastern Republic in the 1920s, showing exactly which sentences were true, which sentences were what Moscow thought the West would like to hear, and what statements were in fact false. On the basis of that analysis, in that case, she said that 90% of the information in disinformation was true. But somebody has to know enough to be able to parse that out. And third, it will be necessary for Western governments and intellectual communities to begin to think about how to deliver its findings both to foreign audiences and to domestic ones, rather than to assume that false statements, especially if they're only partially false, will fall of their own weight. Recognizing that disinformation is what we have is the easiest of these 3 steps. But what is striking is that almost not one Western government has been prepared to do so. Disinformation has been used by Western governments and NATO countries in particular since the start of the Ukrainian crisis as a synonym for propaganda, without any appreciation that we're dealing with different phenomena. And until you understand they are different, you cannot counter them. This will make it very, very difficult for us to understand why disinformation is effective, why it will continue to be used, and why it will become ever more important. I can't resist here mentioning another bывший человек, a former person. I believe all languages have at least one word that should be transmitted into English. And the Russian word I like is bывший, which is former, because being a former person, I understand that. But the person I want to urge you all to read is Paul W. Blackstock, the great scholar of subversion in the 1950s and 60s. Someone whose works also are out of print, but whose ideas are certainly continue to be extremely valuable. If we recognize that we are confronted with disinformation, and I hope we will, then we have to develop the kind of expertise that will allow governments and journalists and analysts to take on the task of identifying specific cases of disinformation. That requires that we restart our programs to train people in foreign languages. That means Title VI, that means a whole program, so that we do not have a situation as now where most of our embassy staffers in a variety of countries in the area of the former Soviet space speak Russian rather than the local language. It's absolutely essential, because if we don't do that, we won't even see what's going on. It is very difficult sometimes to parse out what's true, untrue, and want to be true in disinformation. If you're not reading it in the original language, you will not see that as readily, and therefore we have to have that kind of skill. It isn't good enough just to know Russian. Because one of the things that is happening, and having wasted a good part of my life learning 13 languages in this region, to read, not to speak. On a good day I speak English, but reading, is that the disinformation, the balance of information, truth, false, and want to be true, being put out in different languages varies at the same period of time. As we would expect, the messages that are being delivered, for example, in Finnish, are distinct from the messages that are being delivered in Polish, are distinct from the messages that are being delivered in Russian. And it means if we are going to be able to protect all these countries, we have to have the skill to do it. At a minimum, we are going to have to spend some money to get people trained in languages, and we are going to have to restore the Foreign Broadcast Information Service or something like it, so that people will have access to more and better translations rather than the machine translations, which are truly, truly depressingly bad. The real challenge ahead of us is countering disinformation. That is, of course, both a technical issue and a political one. Technically, it means that we have to begin to develop channels and instrumentalities to deliver alternative messages, including international broadcasting. Had the United States had the capacity to broadcast in Russian 24/7 on a TV network to the non-Russian countries of the Soviet West, including Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine would not have happened. The impact of Moscow television on Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine is staggering. And it is worse because it was not countered. The governments of Ukraine and the other countries in the region have been reluctant to put money into Russian language broadcasting because they see that as undermining their national interest. Therefore, it has to be done by an outside party, namely the European Union, or better, the United States. Had we done it, we could have done this. Had we been able to speak to them, they would not have accepted this. I will just permit me one more story. I happen to have been in Estonia on the day that the ruble collapsed in August of 1998. You remember when they went bankrupt, in fact. We're seeing it again, but when they went bankrupt. And on Estonian TV was the saddest news report I've ever seen. It showed Russian-speaking residents of Estonia lining up to buy food and toilet paper and other goods in Narva because they were afraid their currency was about to collapse, because they had seen pictures on Moscow television of people lining up to buy food and toilet paper with rubles, but in Estonia, the Estonians were paying with crowns. Reaching those people is absolutely essential. We also need the capacity to reach the peoples of the Russian Federation. The era of shortwave broadcasting and longwave broadcasting is over. There's almost no audience for them. Tragically, the US government made a decision about 15 years ago to go into FM broadcasting, without asking themselves the obvious question, how can you broadcast to something that's only can carry for about 75 miles in any direction other than on the territory of the government to which you wish to broadcast? And if you have to have your place on that territory, how are you going to prevent your journalists from bending to make sure they don't offend the local government? Just as IREX was one of the great Soviet triumphs by creating a sense in the American Academy that no one could be a specialist on the Soviet Union without having spent a year there, so too the willingness of the West to demand that they go to FM broadcasting guaranteed was also a victory for the Russian side, because it meant that those people could no longer report anything that the host government didn't like. So we already gelded ourselves. What is necessary is to move to the next generation. That generation is not the internet. The internet is part of it, but it is a small thing. What is necessary is direct-to-home satellite TV. So that you don't have to have anything on the territory of the target audience, and so that you can deliver messages and counter those who are otherwise hearing only one half of a disinformation argument. That will not be inexpensive, but it will not be as expensive as not doing it. And if we wait, as we seem inclined to do at present, there's been discussions in the EU and here about having a 24/7 TV network locally, and those discussions have gone nowhere, unfortunately, even if restricted only to the Baltic countries. But what we need to know is that there are two large countries on Earth that are busily working to direct to home satellite TV broadcasting. China, surprise, surprise, and the Russian Federation. What that will mean is a delivery of this disinformation into your home and mine. But the hardest task of countering disinformation, which is being rebroadcast by Westerners inside their own country, is to counter the elites that are doing it. It will not be difficult to close down institutions like that of Andronik Migranyan in New York. Lifting some visas would be enough. Nor will it be enough to identify those think tanks that are taking money from foreign governments. And it was striking, of course, that the New York Times, in a long tradition, pointed to people who were taking money from just about everyone else except the Russian government. Because if they had had to identify the institutions that were taking money from the Russian government, they would have had to name names of people who frequently written on their op-ed pages. And that would have called into question certain assumptions about the nature of the world. Okay? Now, we're going to have to be willing to take on the task of challenging them. I think institutions like IWP are a good place to start. Now, all of this brings me back to Natalie Brock. Probably most of you have never read anything by Natalie. Probably some of you have not heard of her, although she has been described by any number of experts who knew her as one of the leading authorities on propaganda and disinformation in congressional testimony. She has provided the fundamental insights about the nature of disinformation. One comment she made that I'd like to end with is that propaganda is obvious to anybody with any brains. But disinformation is not. And countering it, identifying it and countering it requires far more skills than people normally have. If we are going to get in this game, we need to understand that we are confronted with a disinformation challenge. We need to understand that this kind of challenge will be much harder for us to counter because we will not have the option that we have preferred to adopt of simply being dismissive of all of it, because to the extent we are dismissive, we will find ourselves unable to counter it, and it will continue to have an impact both there and here. As I said at the outset, Natalie wrote over 30 major studies on disinformation and deception and propaganda. Of those, none are in print. There is not even at present a good annotated bibliography of Natalie's works. Somebody who's gone through and at least written a paragraph on sort of what each is about. Let me just read you the titles of 5 that I picked out of these roughly 30. And then let's talk about what we should do. One was called Window on Russia, which was her story of the Riga legation, which which is ground zero, if you will, of the beginning of Russian, Soviet expertise in the United States. Second, the second book is called Communist Psychological Offensive, Distortions in the Translation of Official Documents, where she traced just how things were being mistranslated as a disinformation effort. I haven't seen anything done like that in the United States since 1990. And yet we are going to confront it again. Third book, Deception, a Tool of Soviet Foreign Policy. Fourth, Murder in the Tiergarten, the Political Life of Vladimir Orlov, Intelligence Agent and Disinformation Specialist. And fifth, Soviet Diplomatic Maneuvers, an episode in the history of the Far Eastern Republic. What I would like to urge, and what I think we have a good chance of doing using IWP as a base, is assembling a collection of the excerpts of Natalie's most important works and making sure it becomes available once again to a wider audience. Most of these things are old enough now not to be in copyright, or they can be, the copyright I'm sure can be easily secured. And that, together with an annotated guide to the entire lot, I think can make a contribution. So we will first begin to understand what disinformation is, why it isn't just propaganda, and why it is such a dangerous thing in the world today, and is going to become more dangerous as long as Vladimir Putin is able to continue to promote his destructive schemes against the neighbors of the Russian Federation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Goble. We'd like to take some questions, but because our event is being recorded this afternoon, we do request that you state your name and affiliation prior to stating your question.
We're taking it all day. Yes, sir.
Robert Simmons, former Foreign Service officer, area where concentration was former Soviet Union. So thank you for this lecture. Just a couple of thoughts. I applaud the challenges that the West is trying to make to try to balance some of the perspectives that individuals will have in terms of the media. I see a big challenge in that historically the former Soviet countries have always had some economic ties and political ties back home. And how do you see the West sort of combating that sort of major influence when that has never come from the Western part?
Well, I think several things. One is one shouldn't be surprised that countries that were once part of an empire would have some ties or continue to have ties with the imperial center. That's been true of all empires. The difference is that in some cases, Western countries have promoted the decline in those ties, and in other places they have seen them as a justification for insisting that the governments go along with whatever the imperial center still wants. One example of that is that in every case of imperial dissolution until 1991, the United States moved the countries that escaped empires into different bureaus of the Department of State overnight. No one suggested that keeping India in the Bureau of British Affairs was a good idea after India became independent. The reality, however, is that we have tended to treat this case as different. I think that's a mistake. Second point is economics aren't everything. One of the things that amazes me, or doesn't amaze me, I'm an ethics specialist, so it doesn't amaze me. Americans tend to believe that everyone is motivated by the same hierarchy of goods as we are, and therefore money matters most. Well, that's simply not true. Lots of countries have pursued independence where they saw their economy decline after independence, but they decided that independence was worth more than that. Some of the countries around Russia's periphery have done very well, thank you very much. Estonia has done remarkably well, in large measure because the Russians did a really stupid thing there. In '92, they told the Estonians that you will pay world prices for oil and gas, and you will pay in hard currency. To which the Estonians replied, if we have to buy pay world prices. We will not buy them from you. We'll buy them from anyone else. And then they said, and we don't have any hard currency, so we won't be buying anything at all. It was a very tough 1992, and Estonia was saved only because of the actions of the Finns and the Swedes. But at the end of that year, Estonia had gone, or from the first of the year to the end of the year, Estonia went from 96% integrated with the Russian economy to 84% integrated with Western Europe. So yes, it's tough, but economics isn't everything. And it is also not necessarily the case that the economic things that are described are the same arrangements. You can price what was taken as well as what's given, and we tend only to take one valuation, not the other. So.
Eva Burns, I'm a friend of IWP. I have one remark regarding teaching foreign languages in American to American. Maybe Americans should start teaching their own grammar in the American public schools to enable the students to learn foreign languages. That's maybe one point. And I have a question also. One, why do you think, why is it convenient for the outsiders to think that the Russian minorities are oppressed in the in the other countries? And the other question to you is, why are Russian people still willing to believe what their government, Putin, is saying, and what is the base of his popularity since communism supposedly finished? And I guess you understand the background of my question.
Well, I completely agree that grammar should be taught. One of the reasons I was told you learn foreign languages is so you could learn grammar and then bring it back into English. Because most people had never heard of the parts of speech until they'd taken a foreign language course. So that's true. I think that it's important to look at the pattern of complaints about oppression of ethnic Russians in the post-Soviet states in order to understand just how distorted things are. There have been vastly more complaints in the American media about the mistreatment of people, of ethnic Russians in the Western republics than there have been about their mistreatment in Central Asia. Whereas in reality, they have been much more mistreated in Central Asia than they were mistreated elsewhere. I believe it has a lot to do with a historical mythology that also happens not to be true. Most of the pogroms in the Pale, the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, were conducted and organized by the Russian state and its agents and using ethnic Russians. However, Adnaka, if you read Western descriptions, it is always the Ukrainians did this, or the Lithuanians did this, or so forth, okay? Now,
so it's not understanding by the
well, no, it's
Westerners,
people like the West doesn't get it. The West has. That's right. Look, we have listened for 6 months with people not being able to describe the people in Luhansk and Donetsk as Russian agents in place, or this being an act of aggression. We've had insurgents, hybrid war, God knows what else, but anything but describing it accurately. Why do people believe? Well, first off, it's quite amazing. One of the good things about being semi-retired and living in a small town is you realize how much deference there is to the government in the population, even in our own country. Less in this administration than in some, but still an amazing amount. People are unwilling, in a large measure, to challenge what the government says. And they're especially unwilling to challenge it if it serves other purposes that are psychologically beneficial. If you can convince yourself of the message that Russians would be living like Americans if only Ukraine was not independent.
Yeah, but how can Russians
Well,
believe that
people,
they had
forgive me, we have good data that people believe that their economic problems are rooted in the fact that the Soviet Union came apart. That, and therefore, if somebody says something which is, I mean, that's why I said true, things that are true, things that are plausible, and things that you want to be true, and things that are false. Well, for a lot of people, it seems plausible that their country has suffered because the Soviet Union is no more. Putin speaks to this, greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. Well, a lot of people believe that. Now, some of us think it would have been a good idea to get in and mix it up and counter that, but we didn't. Anyway, that's me.
My name is Maria Flores. I'm with the Embassy of Estonia. And I have a question regarding the 24/7 broadcasting channel in Russian language. Actually, Undersecretary Stengel said yesterday that the U.S. won't support this project because broadcasting is an old model. And although he said that yes, Russia is very effective in this, but Stengel said that that the U.S. should concentrate more on new technology, social media. So do you think?
Well, we've lived with a Twitter in our embassy in Moscow, so why not?
Well, my question is, yes, I've seen, for instance, the U.S. Embassy in Tallinn recently, I think, started tweeting and using Facebook in Estonian, English, and Russian. So do you think, or how should we, or anyone, convince the U.S. government to actually go back to the old model? That's,
Well, I don't want to go back to the old model. What I'm saying is, their media, and especially international media, is a very, very complicated thing. But delivering messages by tweets and blog posts is not how you do it most effectively. The old model of broadcasting in this country was what was called appointment broadcasting. In other words, people knew that a program was on at 8:30 on Tuesday night and they listened to it. People knew that a program was on Radio Free Europe's Estonian service at 10 p.m. on Thursdays and they listened to it. The new model of media behavior is people less and less are engaged in appointment media. They want media that's where they turn it on, they're listening in the car, there's so many platforms now. I regret to say, I think the statement that the distinguished senior American official said has got a whole bunch of holes in it. If you want to have an impact, what you have to produce is a 24/7 TV thing that people can turn and have on in the background. We've got lots of data that has much greater impact. If you look, one thing, there has been much joy in the land about the twits of the former American ambassador to Moscow. Well, if you look at the total audiences of those twits, they are about, a tenth of what you would expect on any hour of any day on Moscow television. And you have to go to them. I think social media is a very powerful tool, but I don't think it's a powerful tool for dealing with disinformation and countering propaganda. Because what you need to do is to have something that people will simply go to naturally. Because my view remains that if we had supported a 24/7 Russian language TV project in the Baltic States, which I was sure was going to be killed because I even knew who was going to kill it, you would have things like soap operas. You'd have the full range of a TV network. And of course there would be congressional hearings about why are we paying for Mexican soap operas. Well, you're paying for them because people then use that, they just keep that channel on all the time. But that's not, talking about old media model, I got the numbers, and the numbers don't show that. If you want to target things very specifically, if you want to get people organized for a demonstration, tweets work, and Facebook works, if you want to shift public attitudes broadly, they simply don't. That's not something that Goble dreamed up to say to you right now. That's something from National Opinion Research Center in this country. That's something we get from the Levada Center in Moscow. I mean, you know, again, this is a distinction between those things that are true, those things that are false, and those things that we would like to be true.
Carl Goble, part-time student here, also retired U.S. Customs agent. During 2001, I worked at the Trade Center sites in New York in part of the cleanup, and turning the disinformation lens inwardly and asking the question of what happens when a country's disinformation begins to unravel from the overseas perspective, specifically concerning World Trade Center number 7, the third tower that collapsed that day. 47-story steel building collapsed in 7 seconds at 5:20 in the afternoon. There are several thousand architects and engineers around the world that have, and they persist in spreading word that Newton's laws will not be compromised, that defies the laws of physics. And actually, if one further analyzes all 3 towers, that they're not credible, the official stories of collapse. Are you familiar with World Trade Center 7? And
I know. Yes, I know about that. I also know that if the goal of Al Qaeda had been to do real damage, they wouldn't have attacked either any of the 3. They would have attacked a building 6 blocks away, which was where you have 60,000 gallons of fuel in the basement, which is the node for internet connectivity between New York and Europe. And if that had been hit, you would have taken out the World Trade Center towers and much else. Yeah, no, I mean, the node, the internet node is about 6 blocks from where that is, and with this huge fuel supply so they can keep things running if power goes out. With respect to these, one of the things I believe, and it's you know, I'm a benighted American from the darkest Midwest, but one of the things I believe is we benefit by playing it absolutely straight. The smartest thing we ever did in international broadcasting was to broadcast the Watergate hearings in translation to Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. Why? Because it showed our government not to its best advantage, and you can imagine how many people there were on the Hill and elsewhere who were upset by this. But what was the message that was picked up by this? Oh my God, here's a country that's going to bring down its president and can, because he wanted to bug an office? I mean, I'm in favor of if there's evidence, put it out, because I think you ultimately benefit that way. Do I think that this government or any government, any country has a real perfect track record? No. What I do think, however, is we're talking with respect to the Russian government of an order of magnitude problem in terms of the level of importance. But what you're talking about is something that should be discussed. And if I were involved in U.S. broadcasting policy, my view would be, bring it up, put it out there. And I realize that that's not everybody's. A lot of people don't want to wash dirty linen of any kind ever. And I think, quite frankly, we benefit when we show ourselves strong and confident enough to do it. One of the things that distresses me in my decaying years is that we seem to have lost our sense of self-confidence. I'm quite confident that there's nothing that couldn't be reported, that couldn't be dealt with, that can't be explored. What I'm troubled by is this defensiveness, this discussion we've had on international broadcasting on the Hill in the last 3 to 6 months has acted as if we have to engage in propaganda. Wrong. We benefit by producing news. And unfortunately, we've lost the confidence in it.
Actually, just to the benefit of those present, there has actually just been finally a breakthrough in mainstream media. C-SPAN had Richard Gage, the president of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, on for about 40 minutes in the last 2 weeks, and focused on World Trade Center 7 and the actual physics and evidence of that. So it merits watching, I think, for anyone.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. My name is Wally Elson. I'm Vice President of Consulting Group, which is a communication company. Thank you for your lecture. and I'm very much interested in information. I was wondering if there's if there's unconscious disinformation, and how do you account for that, one, and two, do you have how with in looking at the Russian issue and U.S. ability for speaking to the Russian population, how would the insertion in this narrative of Snowden, what kind of complex would that have?
I mean, okay, you're asking a bunch of questions.
Just two things.
Okay, well, I don't believe there's unconscious disinformation at the point of origin. I believe there may be unconscious disinformation down the chain. In other words, someone has to make a decision about this combination of truth, untruth, and wannabe in order to achieve a particular goal. That may be repeated down the line by any number of people who are not aware of what they are doing. I used to say about certain senior officials that there were two possibilities. They either knew what they were doing or they didn't, with the first being slightly worse. But that's a terrible thing to say. With respect to Mr. Snowden's behavior and the Russian government's provision of a kind of a temporary asylum, my view is that I cannot I cannot defend what he exposed, but I cannot defend his method of exposing it. I believe that when one takes an oath to protect classified information, it is to be taken seriously, and the only time that you would be justified in violating it would be if you had exhausted all the mechanisms that exist within the system to bring a problem forward. He did not do that. That's been pretty well established. Instead, he went for the quick and dirty, and he violated the law, and he violated an oath. I find a lot of the coverage conveniently forgets that by focusing on some of the things he's exposed. It is not true, as he and his friends insist, that this was the only way to get this out. It is not true that there was no mechanism in place to deal with these kinds of complaints and charges. Had he availed himself of that mechanism and not gotten anywhere, then we would have a different conversation. But he did not do that. So that's the case, which is very complicated. But that's basically what. Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you. My name is Valery Kovalevsky. I'm a former docent diplomat at Goble. Thank you so much for an outstanding and very timely lecture. Very important subject.
Thank you.
I have two questions. First one, you talked about mostly about government-to-government interaction, how governments can raise awareness, how they can counter this information from Russia in this case. Do you have any ideas or recommendations how to help general population identify and counter, or probably elites, at least elites, to deal with this information? And second question regarding the foreign languages that you recommend to study. Recently there was some talk about necessity of investing more in Russian studies in Washington, D.C. because it was in decline for a number of years. But at the same time, nobody speaks about other former Soviet Union countries.
Right.
There were no studies of them whatsoever. Ukraine, Belarus, Baltic states, Central Asia, Caucasus, etc. Do you think it would be feasible time to do this?
We are simply wrong in the way we are thinking about what languages we need to train in, and we have forgotten two things. One is fairly easy to remedy, or at least intellectually, and the other isn't. Okay? The fact is that unless we have trained people who know a variety of languages in these countries and elsewhere, we will not know what is going on, because people tell you different things when they speak the language of the empire than they do when they speak the language of the nation. I promise you that that is true. and we are missing out. Therefore, we do need training in Belarus. I would like to see the day come when no one who went to the American Embassy in Minsk did not know Belarus. I would like to see that day. I may not live that long, but I would like to see it happen. Having said that, there's a second problem, and this is the one that people like me in the late 80s and early 90s didn't understand. I didn't anyway, and no one pointed it out to me because it's so obvious once you think about it that you should. And that is, how do you create a career path for somebody who speaks Uzbek? You know, let's say you're a person who's 21 years old and you've learned Uzbek and you decide you want to devote your career to the study of Uzbekistan and you want to work in the government to promote good relations with Tashkent, okay? And so, okay, in your first job in the department, you get to punch visas in Tashkent, then you come back and you're third secretary on the desk, and then you get to go over and be an assistant in INR, and then working on Central Asia, and then if you're real lucky, you get to go back to Tashkent as a second secretary, and what kind of a career are you going to have? It's going to be real tough. It's going to be real tough, because there just aren't that many jobs that allow you to stay in the job. I always wanted to work on the non-Russian peoples of the Soviet Union, and I had 14 jobs between the time I came to Washington and the time I retired. And they were in almost 14 different agencies, which tells you I couldn't keep a job. But the point I was about was that I wanted to work in one thing. But that, you can't make a career path out of that for regular thing. You've got to have a reasonable expectation. Being a GS-12 when you're 28 is great. Being a GS-12 when you're 45 and have 2 kids in college is an invitation to treason. David Ignatius in his book Ciro describes treason as the ultimate midlife crisis. Because in our government, we pay people pretty well early on, we promote them up to so far, and then they sit for all those years when they've got kids in college. And, you know, they're available, unfortunately. I think we've got to address the career path problem. I don't know how to do it, but I think you have to recognize that it exists. I mean, I would like to see us have ways that people would learn language, you know, less notable, less widely spoken languages, and we would keep it up. But I find it unconscionable that in a number of places, the only people who speak the local language well enough at American embassies to watch TV or listen to the radio are Foreign Service nationals. And the fact is, those people have at least 2 salaries, and in Central Asia, usually 3. And the second and third salary are more important than the one they get from us in terms of what they're going to do. And that means that we are flying blind in a whole bunch of places, and that's a really scary thing. People don't even want to recognize that it's a problem up to now. And people somehow think that everyone will, if the old elite spoke Russian, everyone speaks Russian. I promise you that in most empires, when they fall apart, the new national elites tend to want to have a different language. When my family has been here since 1631, but during the Revolution, half of it fought for the British and half of it fought for the Americans. One half was expelled to Canada at the end. But I should tell you that the one that stayed here was actively involved with Ben Franklin's campaign to get Americans to speak German so that it wouldn't be the language of the empire. It's not atypical for countries, but if they have a national language that they care about, then you pay attention to it. And we're going to have to address that, or we're not going to know what's going on. And that's hard. Okay?
Professor, I think
That's
we have
it?
time for one more question.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. My name is Steve Schweitzer. I'm a student here at IWP. During the course of your speech and your question and answer, you indicated you had some data on media and viewing habits within Russia and its satellite states.
Sure.
I guess could you expand on that a little bit
Well, I
more?
won't call
And
them satellite states. That may be the State Department's goal,
Sorry,
but not yet.
Please accept my apologies. Awesomer countries. And anyway, I guess could you elaborate more on some of those trends? And do you notice a distinction in terms of, based upon ages, what types of media there's a preference towards?
The younger the person, the more likely they're going to watch TV.
Okay.
the more likely they're going to use internet. There's so much of this material. If the place to start, what's her name at Duke? Ellen Prof-Mickiewicz. Ellen has a good book on Russian television, and she assembles a lot of the data on that. There's also in the go to the Levada Center website, and there are blocks of data, good data. But I would start with Ellen's book on Soviet and Russian television. Another person who's done yeoman work in this more narrowly is Maria Lauriston at the University of Tartu in Estonia. And she's got a series of things looking at this. What's interesting is that some of the expectations we have, that people in their 20s are all going to be on the internet and people in their 60s are still going to read newspapers. One of the things, just to give you one example of how things break down because of ways you don't think. All kinds of people in the West were thrilled when some of the Turkic republics, countries, shifted their alphabets from a Cyrillic-based one to a Latin script based on the Turkish one, okay, because it would integrate them with the Turkish world. The consequence of that was that the older generation stopped reading. Because they didn't like having to read in an alphabet that they didn't grow up with. So what happens is that in Azerbaijan, for example, people over 50 have more or less stopped reading the newspapers. If you can do an age stratification. So there are all these little curlicues, and it's not a simple thing, but the idea that everybody is trending toward the internet, and that the internet has the same kind of impact on values, judgments, whatnot, which is widespread among people whose opinions come from the New York Times, and I get the Times every day, okay, but the fact is, this just doesn't happen to be totally true. And each new media, each new channel has different consequences, and often ones we don't expect. The one thing I think the shift to internet is doing is it is reducing America's already incredibly short time horizon. Americans get bored with anything that lasts more than to the second commercial. And if it lasts to the third commercial, we want to have something to make us feel good about a kid with a rabbit or something in, because, why do we want to see all this nonsense? So I would suggest when one talks about the media, that it's a very bad idea to talk about old media and new media, and assuming that the new media is simply sweeping the board with younger people. But that is the view which, as you reported, unfortunately informs the thinking of some senior people. Actually, I know where it comes from, mid-range people, but still, it's media, international media is complicated. But I'll tell you one last thing, and then I got to shut up over time. The reason that U.S. international broadcasting worked in the 50s and 60s and 70s was because it was there all the time and forever. One of the things that I was shown, and which I wish I owned, my friend, the late Leonard Mary, who's president of Estonia, kept notebooks in which he recorded each day between 1950 and 1988 whether he could hear Deutsche Welle, VOA, RFRL, and the BBC, whether it was jammed. And I've seen these, a whole stack of them, each day marked in. It was the fact that we did it again and again and again. If you do something once, it may make a splash, but it won't necessarily change things. It's consistency and long period of doing it. In a country like ours, which thinks that the second commercial is far too far into the future to think about, that's going to be difficult to insist upon, especially when you have people who chant the mantra that everybody's reading 140 characters or less. But they're wrong. I mean, they're wrong.
That's why I asked the questions.
That would be right. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take care.